They came to say goodbye to a legendary pastor. But what his wife revealed that day left the entire world in stunned silence. This was not just a funeral, it became a moment that changed everything people thought they knew. The world has just bid farewell to Pastor John MacArthur, one of the most respected spiritual leaders of our time. But surprisingly, it was his wife, Patricia MacArthur, who stole the moment with a heartfelt tribute that left everyone in stunned silence. Her words were honest, powerful, and far from what anyone expected. What she shared about their private life, after so many years of quiet, changed everything. People thought they knew. Pastor Joel MacArthur's passing felt like the closing of a chapter in church history. For over 50 years, his strong voice shaped churches, trained leaders, and touched countless lives worldwide. But on the day thousands gathered to honor him, it was his quiet, supportive wife, Patricia, who became the heart of the service in a way no one saw coming. What was supposed to be a moment of shared grief turned into one of the most moving tributes the Christian community had ever witnessed. Patricia, always known for standing beside her husband quietly, stepped forward. People thought she would say a few kind words. Instead, she poured out a deeply personal message, showing the human side of the man many only knew as a bold preacher. She spoke not only of his faith and ministry but also of his fears, silent battles, and the heavy cost that came with his calling. Her eyes welled with tears, her voice shaking at times, as she opened up about their hidden struggles, leadership burdens, and the moments she wished he could simply step back from it all. One story, in particular, left everyone story about John's darkest moments and how their love endured public pressure and private doubts. It was more than just a tribute. It was a rare, honest look into a life, a marriage, and a ministry that was far more complex than anyone imagined. What she revealed was powerful, emotional, and unforgettable. The funeral of Pastor John MacArthur was unlike anything the modern evangelical world had witnessed. It took place at Grace Community Church in Sun Valley, California, the very sanctuary where John had faithfully preached for more than 50 years. The atmosphere inside that church was heavy with a mix of deep respect, genuine sorrow, and quiet reverence. It felt as though every person in attendance understood they were part of a moment far bigger than themselves. The turnout was nothing short of extraordinary. Thousands of people filled the church, some arriving hours early just to find a seat. Many had traveled great distances, wanting to honor a man whose teachings had touched their lives in countless ways. But it was not just the crowd inside the building that made the event historic. Millions more tuned in from around the world, watching the live broadcast. In just 48 hours, over 2.5 million people had viewed the service online, and overwhelming show of how far John's influence had reached. What stood out most was the presence of church leaders, pastors, missionaries, and ministry workers from nearly every corner of the globe. They came from countries as far away as South Korea, Nigeria, and South America, flying in not just to pay their respects, but to stand in unity with a man who had shaped so much of modern Christian thought. Their presence spoke volumes about the impact John had, an influence that stretched far beyond denominational lines or theological debates. Inside the sanctuary, there was a shared understanding that this was not an ordinary funeral. It was the closing of a chapter in church history, a moment that marked the end of an era. The weight of that reality hung in the air, pressing gently on the hearts of all who had gathered. Conversations were soft, embraces were sincere, and every glance toward the pulpit carried a sense of quiet reflection. Even those watching from afar seemed to feel the gravity of the occasion. Social media flooded with clips from the service, quotes from John's sermons, and personal testimonies of lives changed by his ministry. Some shared how his teaching had guided them in moments of doubt. Others spoke of finding clarity and conviction through his words. And many simply expressed gratitude for a man who had remained faithful to his calling through every challenge. This was more than a farewell to a preacher. It was a global gathering of hearts united by faith, drawn together by the life and legacy of one man who had given everything to serve God and his people. The funeral stood as a powerful reminder not of celebrity, but of a life faithfully lived in the service of truth, love, and grace. The service began with Pastor Tom Pennington, a close friend and student of John's, sharing heartfelt words. Fighting back emotion, he called John a mentor who never traded truth for approval, even when it cost him dearly. He feared God more than man, Tom said, and that's why we trusted him. A powerful choir performance of it as well with My Soul followed, moving many to tears, even among those who had stood alongside John in ministry. But everything shifted when Patricia slowly made her way to the stage. The room went completely quiet. Those expecting a brief thank you were left astonished. She gently placed her hand on the pulpit where John had preached for 55 years, closed her eyes for a moment, and then spoke. "You all knew the preacher," she began softly, "but I want to tell you about the man I knew. The man I loved, the man who faced dark times, doubts, and surrender." Her words were not just comforting. They opened a window into their private world. She spoke of nights when John questioned himself, the pressure of speaking for God week after week, and his deep fear of ever leading anyone the wrong way. She shared how he carried both the weight of the church and their family and how sometimes it nearly crushed him. One of the most touching moments was when Patricia told how John almost resigned during a season of deep sadness and silences, truth no one outside their family had ever known. The church sat in quiet disbelief. For a man known for his strength, hearing about his hidden struggles made him seem even more real, more human. By the time Patricia ended her heartfelt words, most of the crowd sat with tear-streaked faces, but it was far from over. Just as she stepped away from the podium, something made her turn back. Her hands shook, her eyes shone with emotion, yet her voice remained steady. Slowly, she reached inside her Bible, the very one John had gifted her in their early marriage, and pulled out a small, folded note. Then she said something that made the entire sanctuary fall silent. "I did not know if I would share this today, but before John left us, he gave me this letter and said, 'Read it whenever you are ready.' I think now is that moment." The church held its breath. This was not a public statement or a farewell written for applause. This was something personal, an open door into the heart of a man known mostly for his bold sermons and sharp mind. As Patricia carefully unfolded the letter, she began reading John's words. "My dearest Patricia, if you are reading this, the Lord has called me home. And though I am filled with joy to see his face, my heart breaks knowing I must leave yours." He called her his quiet strength, a voice that encouraged him in doubt, the steady hand that held him when he felt weak. John wrote, "The world may remember the sermons, the books, the debates, but I will remember you, the one who held me together when I felt I was falling apart." Soft sobs echoed in the room. Patricia's voice quivered as she read on. John confessed there were times when ministry felt like a heavy burden, when it drained his spirit instead of lifting it. And in those moments, he leaned on Patricia's faith. She reminded him he was not a title, not a movement, but a man saved by grace. But then came words no one expected. John openly regretted not making more time for family. He admitted missing birthdays, skipping moments that mattered, choosing sermons over special memories. "If I had the chance again," he wrote, "I would love louder, sooner, softer." For a man known for his strong, unshakable presence, this raw honesty hit deeply. By the time Patricia finished reading John's heartfelt letter, it was as if the entire sanctuary held its breath. The final words of that message echoed far beyond the pulpit. "I hope people remember I loved well, even with all my flaws. I never aimed to be perfect, only faithful." In that quiet moment, as Patricia gently folded the worn piece of paper, it felt like the room itself was wrapped in a sacred stillness. Tears rolled silently down faces, even among John's closest friends, men known for their strong voices and sharp theology who now sat with heads bowed, deeply moved. What Patricia held in her hands was more than a letter. It was a legacy sealed in ink, a confession of a heart softened by years of service, love, and hard-earned grace. John MacArthur had spent decades preaching from pulpits around the world, delivering sermons packed with biblical truth and unwavering conviction. Yet in those final words, without a microphone or crowd in front of him, he preached what many would later call his most powerful sermon, a raw, honest message straight from his heart. As Patricia stepped away from the podium, clutching the letter close, it felt like time itself paused inside Grace Community Church. The faces in the crowd reflected a shared understanding that they had just witnessed something rare and profound. In that sacred pause, grief met gratitude, and admiration met a newfound awareness of John's humanity. The man they had long seen as a pillar of faith revealed himself not as a flawless figure, but as a man who wrestled with doubt, carried unseen burdens, and loved deeply despite it all. But the service was far from over. Moments after Patricia sat down, Melinda, John's young granddaughter, rose from her seat. Barely 20, she walked to the front with quiet steps, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. When she began to speak, her soft voice filled the space with a gentle strength that caught everyone's attention. Melinda shared a story that brought the church to an almost reverent silence. She spoke of last Christmas, how her grandfather, though frail and weary, had sat with her on the porch for nearly 2 hours. During that quiet moment, she confessed her struggles with faith, admitting that she felt lost and unsure of where she stood spiritually. To her surprise, John did not offer a single verse or sermon. Instead, he simply held her hand and whispered, "Even if you let go of him, he won't let go of you." Those few words left an imprint on Melinda's heart and, now on everyone listening. For many in the room, it was the first time they glimpsed the tenderness behind the theologian's reputation. The moment shattered the long-held image of John as merely a stern scholar, revealing instead a man capable of gentle grace. As the room absorbed Melinda's story, something completely unexpected happened. From the third row, a figure slowly stood up, a man many recognized at once. Dr. Charles Montgomery, a former fierce critic of John MacArthur, and a leading voice in the charismatic church world, made his way toward the podium. Whispers filled the air as people exchanged surprised glances. For years, Charles and John had publicly disagreed on theology, often engaging in heated debates that spilled into print, radio, and even sermons. Many assumed their differences had never been resolved. But now, standing before the congregation, Charles held up an old, faded photo, a black and white snapshot from a seminary debate in 1971, where he and John had once stood side by side. Smiling, with a soft, almost trembling voice, Charles shared how their relationship had quietly shifted over the last 3 years. What began as cautious letters turned into honest emails, and finally, a phone call that changed everything. On that final call, John had said words Charles would never forget. "We both fought for truth. I just wish we'd fought a little more for each other." The crowd reacted with quiet gasps, stunned by this powerful revelation. It was not just a story of reconciliation, it was a living testament to the power of humility and the healing grace of forgiveness. Charles ended his reflection with a sentence that echoed deeply in every heart present. "John and I did not always agree, but I stand here today as proof that grace always wins." The church rose to its feet, not in applause, but in silent awe of what they had just witnessed. What began as a farewell had transformed into a living message of unity, healing, and the unmatched strength of grace. As the service neared its conclusion, most believed they had already witnessed the most emotional moments. But Grace Community Church had one final gesture that would seal this day in memory forever. The lights dimmed slowly. A single spotlight shone on the pulpit, the same pulpit John MacArthur had preached from for more than 5 decades. An elder stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in a deep purple cloth. The congregation watched in silent anticipation. When the cloth was gently lifted, the sanctuary fell completely silent. There, it was John's first Bible, the one he had used for his very first sermon in 1962. The leather was cracked, the pages worn, each mark a quiet witness to years of faithful service. Then came a deeply touching moment. One by one, John's children and grandchildren walked forward. Without a single word spoken, each placed a white rose at the foot of the pulpit. Each rose represented a year of John's ministry, a symbol of love, sacrifice, and unwavering faith. 56 roses in total. The room fell into a hushed silence, no music, no words, no prayer, just 60 full seconds of stillness, one for every year John had poured his life into ministry. The sound of soft sobbing filled the air. Even those watching online reported tears streaming down their faces. It was not just the end of a service, it was the closing of a powerful chapter in church history, a moment that marked both an ending and a beginning. As the silence lifted, the choir softly began to sing, "Great is thy faithfulness." Without needing an invitation, the entire congregation rose, voices united, hearts full, honoring not just a preacher, but a life lived in humble service. But this emotional tribute did not end there. One by one, John's family members walked forward, not with rehearsed speeches, but with heartfelt stories. They spoke not as admirers of a famous preacher, but as children and grandchildren who knew the man behind the sermons. First came Mark MacArthur, John and Patricia's son. Known for staying away from the public eye, Mark quietly took the stage. Instead of starting with praise, he began with honesty. "To the world, my father was a pastor, a scholar, a voice of truth. But to me, he was just Dad. And he was not always easy." A quiet stir passed through the crowd. Mark did not sugarcoat his words. He spoke of a father often torn between his calling and his family, a man sometimes distant, swallowed by the weight of ministry. Yet, Mark also recalled moments when his father's love spoke loudest in small, powerful ways. He remembered the quiet prayers over their heads at night. John standing at the back of his graduation, and even how his father helped him rebuild after a business failure. He may not have said it often, Mark admitted, but in his own way. That was love. Melinda, one of John MacArthur's granddaughters, followed next. Barely 20, she spoke softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. What she shared brought a hush over the entire room. She told how, just last Christmas, despite being weak and frail, her grandfather sat with her on the porch for almost 2 hours. She had opened up about her struggles with faith, confessing she felt lost and unsure. Instead of quoting scripture, John simply held her hand and said, "Even if you let go of him, he won't let go of you." For Melinda, that moment was the first time she saw grace shining through his eyes instead of doctrine. It touched everyone deeply, reshaping how many had viewed the man often seen as strict and scholarly. For years, critics had painted John as cold or rigid, a man locked inside his theological views. But through these personal stories, a softer side of him began to appear, one often hidden behind sermons and books. Then came the most unexpected moment of the day. A man seated in the third row quietly stood and made his way forward. People murmured as they realized who it was: Dr. Charles Montgomery, a former outspoken critic of John MacArthur and a well-known leader in the charismatic church. Their clashes had been public and intense, with Charles once accusing John's beliefs of being a cage of cold intellect. Many believed they had never reconciled. Many thought the most emotional moments had already passed. Patricia's heartfelt tribute, John's deeply personal letter, and the surprising reunion with an old rival had already left everyone deeply moved. But Grace Community Church had one more powerful moment in store. The lights dimmed, and a single spotlight fell on the pulpit, the same one where John had preached more than 5,000 sermons. A church elder stepped forward, holding an item carefully wrapped in a rich purple cloth. No one knew what to expect. As the elder placed it gently on the pulpit and unwrapped it, a reverent silence swept over the crowd. It was John MacArthur's very first Bible, the one he carried when he preached his first sermon back in 1962. Its leather cover was worn thin, its pages fragile from decades of use. This wasn't just a Bible, it was a symbol of a life poured out in service. Then came a moment that no one would ever forget. One by one, John's children and grandchildren walked to the front. Without saying a word, they placed white roses at the foot of the pulpit. Each rose represented a year of John's ministry, a year of love, sacrifice, and leadership. 56 roses in total. And then, silence, no music, no speech, no prayer, just 60 full seconds of quiet, 1 second for every year John had served. The soft sound of weeping filled the sanctuary. Even those watching online later shared that tears had streamed down their faces. It was more than the end of a service. It felt like the closing of a chapter in church history and, yet, also, the start of something new. As the minute of silence ended, the choir began softly singing "Great is Thy Faithfulness." Without needing to be asked, the entire congregation stood. Some lifted their hands. Some stood with eyes closed. Some wept. But every heart was united in that moment, overwhelmed by the weight of a legacy built on faith, love, and grace. Outside the church walls, the bells rang 12 times each chime, symbolizing the 12 New Testament books that John MacArthur had spent years carefully teaching. Verse by verse, as people quietly left the sanctuary, ushers stood at the doors, gently handing out bookmarks. On each one were the words from John's final letter. "I never wanted to be perfect. I just wanted to be faithful." A message, simple, honest, and lasting. Pastor John MacArthur's funeral was never meant to be a grand show or a tribute to fame. It was something far more sacred, a tender look at the man behind the sermons. A man who was flawed yet faithful, deeply loved, and fully redeemed. And right at the center of it all stood Patricia MacArthur, the woman who had carried his silent burdens while the world only saw his powerful preaching. In the days that followed, messages of love and respect poured in from every corner of the world. Pastors, missionaries, authors, even some of his old critics shared heartfelt tributes. Yet, none touched as deeply as a simple handwritten note left at the church's front door by someone who never gave a name. It read, "I never liked John MacArthur until I heard the man his wife described. Now, I want to know the God he served." And maybe, just maybe, that is the kind of legacy that matters most.